Welcome to the Planet Vero Radio, produced in Idea Garden Advertising Studios, and the story of liberty with John Bona.
What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Fight against that? No! We will run, and we will live. Die. Fight, and you may die. Run, and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Good evening, and welcome to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, and with me is Marshall and Dan. You probably know these guys by now, Dr. Marshall Foster and theologian Dan Williamson. Say good evening, guys.
Good evening, John. Hey, great to be back.
Good to be with you as well. You know, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. I thought of that as we were listening to that great clip from Braveheart. And, going back a little bit, Marshall, and back in your day, one of the world's finest news commentators, and probably in your opinion as well, mine, Paul Harvey, he told a story once that a pastor repeated that I heard. And he told us of an experimental chimpanzee, which scientists were determined to teach how to speak. I don't know if you heard this story. They've been working with the animal for 14 years. And the project directors, they really labored patiently with the chimp until it had mastered about 140 signs, which when put together form words. And finally the day arrived when it seemed the chimpanzee was actually going to say something. And the word went out to all the scientists in this complex. And they all crowded into this room and gathered around the cage. And they watched with great expectation as the chimp made these symbols that seemed to be formed into words and then a sentence. And at last, the first message from a non-human, from the world's most pampered, most cared for, most patiently trained, best-fed chimp on the planet was about to come forth. And the scientists, as Paul Harvey told the story, they could hardly contain themselves. And they pressed around the cage to read this history-making sentence. And finally, the chimpanzee said, "Let me out of here." You see, all the training, all the pampering, all the feeding doesn't mean a thing as long as there's no liberty, no freedom. And that's what we're going to...
wisdom there, John, that most people have in the budget committees today.
There's a great deal to say about liberty. In fact, as we'll talk about in part tonight, it's one of the major themes of Scripture. And as you remember, the Old Testament people, they went down to Egypt and they became enslaved for over 400 years. And finally, they were delivered back into their own land. And then years later, because of sin, their sin, they were taken captive to Babylon again for another 70 years of enchainment and imprisonment and lack of liberty. But as we opened the program, we said that Christ said in his very first message that he came to set the prisoners free and to proclaim liberty. He really is the great emancipator. And the Bible makes it clear, unless there's personal liberty and emancipation, there will not be civic or national freedom either. And that being said, we have to ask the question, why are so many nations living in poverty without liberty? And I've been told, and I've checked it out, that about almost half of the world, a little less than half of the world's population, lives in some degree of poverty. Why? And I think through my research and the people I've talked to, the primary reason that nations are in poverty is a lack of, let's say, spiritual resources, the Christian faith, truth. For example, I'll give you an example. India is a good example how a people's religion directly affects its economic prosperity. Now, today, as in the past, India has widespread hunger problems. It's not due to a lack of food. It's a result of the people's religious beliefs. The facts are the major religion in India is Hindu. And the Hindu religion teaches that people who die are reincarnated as animals. Therefore, their laws and their religion prohibit people from eating animals, cows, even mice, and of course they're not going to eat them, but their laws prohibit them from killing them and other animals. Now, there are about 200 million sacred cows in India. Each cow eats enough food to feed 7 people. Now, you do the math. The feed from these cows alone would feed about 1.5 billion people. And that's about a quarter of the world's population today. Now, the mice and the rats, which they're not allowed to kill either, they eat much of the grain. And the grain, not to mention the meat from the cows, and we haven't even talked about that, would supply plenty of food for all the starving people of India. And that's my point, that the economic state of a nation depends upon its religion. Now, Dan, let me ask you, I mean, do you foresee that the Christian religion as the only faith that could bring true liberty and prosperity to America?
Well, if I study the paper trail, as Marshall would put it so eloquently, of history, what we see is any place where a nation or a civilization establishes even some of the simplest biblical principles, they prosper. One of the great civilizations, which it seems like no one even talks about anymore, is the Byzantine Empire. It lasted from 395 after Christ's birth to 1453, where it finally fell to the Desert Scourge. But for 1,000 years, it stood as a civilized nation in a barbaric world, holding the barbarians to the north at bay, holding the barbarians coming from the south at bay. And it's really interesting to think about 4 key principles they built the nation upon. 1 was a good money supply, no dross in the money, good gold and silver coinage. 2, food was the cornerstone of their economy. Yes, they were located on the Bosporus and were a great commerce city, but food was safe and secure and was one of the main trading items. 3, a strong military, a defensive military. They were always trying to kind of defend their borders against all these barbaric enemies, and they had a strong military, and it protected them. They were not an outward attacking army, but a defending army. And last but not least, they took that biblical principle that anybody could be king or emperor. There's one story of a baker that became the emperor of the city. And that city then prospered, having some golden years and some years that were a little more difficult. But this empire lasted 1,000 years, and we don't even hardly talk about it in our history books. But it was based on those biblical principles: no dross in the money, it shall be for food. All men were equal and could become the king. Anybody had the opportunity. Last but not least, they in theory hoed the horses. They weren't an offensive military. They were a defensive military, and a good one, a strong one built of the people. So, we have examples out there of taking biblical principles and building empires that lasted a very, very long time. And obviously that march in history has made for better empires than maybe the Byzantium one was. They weren't perfect, but we really see the culmination of this paper trail of liberty as we approach the American Republic in 1776.
Very interesting. Go ahead, Marshall.
Well, the story of liberty just marches, and that's really the title of our radio show for a reason, and that is that the story of liberty is not just a chance event. America just didn't pop out of the wilderness and come up with the greatest constitutional republic the world's ever known and help to liberate 1 billion people from tyranny. With 102 simple yeomen and farmers from England who come across the ocean with no money, no power, no influence, nothing going for them except the truth and the Bible, and they change a continent, they change a world to this day, 400 years later, where still America rules and reigns over the world in terms of its philosophy and worldview. People still long to come to the land of the free and the home of the brave, even though in some ways we're not so brave anymore and we're not quite so free because we've forgotten our roots. But the truth of that story, the greatness of this liberation of the mankind from 5,000 years of tyranny, the contrast is just not understood by most people. Most people think most people have lived in freedom. They've enjoyed what we've enjoyed. I mean, we go get a latte or take our kids out for ice cream, and we take it for granted. The vast majority of people that have ever lived, vast majority, have never had freedom, never had liberty, never had property, never been able to go wherever they wanted to go, or marry who they married, or have the religion that they wanted. It was all determined for them by a small minority who raped, pillaged, and took everything they had. And that was true of the Greeks and of the Romans and the Egyptians. It was true of the barbarians from Germany. It was true of the Aztecs and the Incas and the Chinese emperors and the Japanese warlords. Wherever you go in the world, it was a top-down, small group take over life until Christ's word, the liberating word, came and taught these biblical principles that all men are created equal, that there is no partiality with God, and that each one of us is created in the image of God. And so the human being is sacred. You can't just kill somebody without due process, without having a trial. And it goes on and on. The biblical laws and principles that are built into the words of Scripture have exploded upon the world in the last 4 centuries because the Bible was only slowly unleashed after the time of Christ, because sooner rather than later it became locked into Latin, and the vast majority of people weren't able to read it. In the 16th century, it was translated into the language of the people, especially in the English language. You see that happening in England and Scotland and over to America, and they took that as their handbook for liberty. And so you have the common man reading this book that tells them that God is sovereign, not the king. The king can't rape and pillage you. If he does, he no longer should be king. And so the people began to reason and think, and finally England and especially America then went to take these principles and apply them, and we end up with the miracle of America. It is a Christian miracle, and every historian practically through this was not even a question that America was a Christian nation founded on Christian principles. In fact, just to give you the statistics of that, 99.5% of the people in 1776, 99.8% were professing Christians. 98.4% of them were Protestant, 1.4% of them were Roman Catholic. So all but 0.2% considered themselves believing Christians. And Benjamin Franklin said, you can go anywhere in America without ever in your lifetime meeting an atheist or an infidel. And, he went on and talked about the amazing way in which this Christian nation was built. And Benjamin Franklin's not known as the best Christian in America himself, but he understood, he was a wise old man, that the very basis of liberty was biblical Christianity, and that's what America